Hello guys, welcome back to John's Workshop. In this video, this will be the start of a series of probably 2 or 3 videos, something like that. The time's finally come and we're going to strip the head off the milling machine. So I don't know how many videos it will take, but the plan is get the head off, get the oil out, give it a good clean up, remove any of the sort of paint and iron filings or bits of casting and whatever else is going to be in here. I'm quite sure it'll be quite ugly. I have run this, as you'll have seen if you've watched some of my videos. It's had a decent run since I bought it, so it's time to sort of drop the oil, give it a good clean out, and what I'm planning to do, or hoping to do, is as I disassemble it, I'm going to remove all of the bearings that are in here, both on the spindle and on all the gear shafts that are inside. We're going to measure them up and we're going to order some decent quality bearings and replace all of the hairdryer bearings that will be in here from build. So what I've noticed, and that's why I wanted to really use it before I did the strip down, you can hear quite a lot of looseness in here, and until I get inside I won't know where it's coming from. Now it's either the bearings themselves are, I suspect they're poor quality anyway, but it's either them that there's play in, or it's where the bearings are actually seating into the castings and there's play there. I'm not sure which, but we'll find out as we get into it. So first job is to start stripping down. We'll get the motor unwired and the motor off, and then following on from that, then I'm going to take the front plate off, the gear selectors off, and just have a good look inside there before I start trying to take the lid off, and just see if I can make my own life easier before we start. So I'll bring you back when we're in the middle of, or once we remove the motor and we're starting to have a look inside the front here. Right then guys, we've got about as far back as I'm going with this. So that's everything out of the head completely. So main spindle is completely out. All of the gear shafts for the speed selection are out, and various other, everything to do with the quill, the rack, the pinion, sorry, for the rack that's on the back of the quill. I've taken all of that out. The spring, the fine feed adjuster that goes on this right hand side, that's out. Obviously all of the oil is out, or majority of it's out. It's still dripping a bit. That's why I've just left, I don't know if you can see that, but I've just got a pot sitting down there collecting the last bits of the oil. So that's kind of it. I didn't film while I was doing this because there was quite a lot of concentration on the go, and I needed to be round and round the machine the whole time, and I'd have been tripping over the tripod. So apologies I didn't film it in action, but what I'm going to do now is take you to the bench in a moment, and I'll walk you through, and this is for me really, as well as anybody else who wants to do this, so that when I come to putting it back together I've got a bit of a diary of how I took it apart. So we'll do that in a second. I'll just probably show you inside here. It's not catastrophic, and I was kind of expecting it to be bad, but it's not too bad. There are some bits, that was floating around in the sump. I don't know if you can see that. It took me a while to try and figure out what that is. I didn't know whether something had broken during the disassembly. It's obviously got a thread form on it, and the more I've disassembled and looked at it, the more I've kind of worked out what it is. And it's actually come from the oil sight glass on the side here. So basically, and you can see the evidence, and I'll show you the evidence on the bench, on all the shafting that goes on the inside. But basically what they've done is, before they fitted this sight glass, that was just an empty hole through the side of the casting, and while they've done that, they've plastic padded, or used some padding of some sort to pad the outside of the casting. They then sprayed the casting with that hole just open, there's a hole, but with all the shafting inside. So, you know, the shafting that's in there has got various amounts of the white paint that I've sprayed the outside of the casting with. And then what's happened, obviously, as they've been putting the padding stuff on the outside to pad the casting out, some of it's got squashed into this hole, and then what they've done is just fitted the sight glass, and it's obviously just cracked that out of the hole in the threads, and it's just dropped down inside the sump. So you know, that's the kind of care and attention that's gone into building this in the factory, which is the reason I've stripped it mainly. So I'll just see if I can bring you in. I'll probably try and do it handheld, so bear with me. And I don't know whether this is going to work or whether you're going to be able to see enough, if there's enough light, but we'll give it a go. I don't have a torch or anything that I can shine in there, but that's kind of what's in there after I've taken everything out. So you can see there's a couple of bearing registers in the bottom for the shafting. There's a poor paint job that's been done to seal the inside of the casting up. I think I've taken everything else out of there, so that's it in the sump. There is quite a lot of very fine, you know, every time I put my finger into the oil, there's some, you know, you can feel it, it's gritty, some real fine grit all in the bottom. So, you know, it really did need a good clean out. So this is going to get completely cleaned in there, thoroughly cleaned out. If there's any bare bits of casting where it's not sealed, I'll paint that, but I don't think there is. First order of the day is going to be to scrape all of this top face and get that clean before I even start, because that's going to just be dropping crap in there. So I'll do that bit first. I'm basically going to start at the top and work down and clean all of that out. In the front, just bear with me, that's what you've got in the front. So there's some micro switches here that are to do with the tapping reverse spindle activity that I'm never going to use because of my 3-phase converter that I use. It just won't accept quick spindle changes, so they're really redundant, to be honest, but I'll leave them in. It's probably as easy to leave them in as take them out. So I'll leave all of those in. But again, you know, just general inside here, you know, all the edges are sharp and there's nothing's been deburred. You know, it's just really, really razor edge casting everywhere. Where they've drilled and tapped holes through, like in the side here, that was to hold the guard in place. You know, all of the crap, all of the swarf from drilling and tapping those holes is just sat in there. I mean, it's not doing any harm in there, it's not in the sump itself, but that's the level of care and attention that the thing's been built with. So I'll cut this now, I'll take you to the bench and I'll show you how I've laid the items out on the bench, and we'll talk. What I want to do is talk through almost in reverse order, well, in the order that I've actually taken the stuff off the machine, which will then become the reverse order of me putting it back together again. So we'll do that now. Okay, so we're at the bench. So the first thing I did was pour myself one of these, just to give myself the courage to actually attack this and take it apart. And I'm just gonna. That's as much as I've drunk since I started, so I'm just gonna have a bit now. I'm about ready for some. Cheers. Right, moving on. So what did I do first? Top cap off, drawbar out of the spindle. So that was the very first thing I did. The next thing I did was drop the head right down as far as it would go, and I took I unwired the motor in this junction box here. So I took the wiring out the back, and then 4 Allen bolts, popped the motor off the top and laid that on the bench. The next thing I took off was this cover plate, which is 6 screws that hold that on the front of the mill. So that came off next. The next job I did after that was, just looking around at what I did next, would be there's some dowel pins here that are threaded in one end. So I made myself up an incredibly crude, and it was incredibly crude, slide hammer with I think this is an M6 thread. So I just threaded a bit of M6 bar, quite a long bit of bar with a shoulder on it, and just put a big other bit of bar that had a hole in, smaller than the shoulder, and just basically used that as a slide hammer to remove these 2 dowels. It's the stuff of black fingernails and nightmares, is homemade slide hammers like that, but you know, fortunately I got away with that one. So we took those 2 dowels out. We then took out the 6 retaining screws that hold the top of the head, this, down to the base casting. So we took those 6 screws out, and then the final thing I took out was the circlip, which sits right at the very top, on top of the top bearing above the spindle. So I took that circlip out. At that point the head was free to move. I then used, and I'll not wind them all the way out, but you can see them there. These are some handles that I bought. These are the ones I mentioned them in one of my previous episodes or videos. I ordered these from Taiwan, and they've just turned up, well, this week. And these are sort of the quick release lock-in handles, and I've actually bought those for all the axis locks on the mill to replace the rubbishy ones that are on there. But fortunately they've got a long enough M8 thread, and I needed 3 of them, so I put 3 in, and I've just used those as jacks to jack that top casting up and break the seal that was under here. And the seal I've used is some, I don't know, silicon type gasket seal. I really don't know what it is. There's certainly no gasket in there, no fibre gasket of any sort. They've just put a very thin coat of this stuff on. So I used the jacking screws to jack that up, and then once I'd got it to, you can see there's ½ an inch pretty much of screw sticking out. It was then a case of sort of wiggling and jiggling and sticking my fingers in and trying to move things around inside to make sure everything was free, until eventually that top plate would lift off. So we got that off. When it came off, this gear shaft has not been out of there yet. That bearing didn't come out of its seat, and I'm leaving it in there just for now, just so that I don't get that shaft mixed up with that shaft. I know that's that shaft, and I know which way up it is, so that's all staying in there just for now. It will be one of the next jobs I do to remove that, because I want to measure up the bearings at each end to get new bearings. But the bearings themselves, I don't know if you can hear that, but that is as rough. I mean, it's a brand new machine. It's done a little bit of work, but that is horrible. There's no other word to describe it. So we're going to pop all of these bearings off. We're going to order new bearings for the speed shafts. This is the shaft that goes right at the back of the mill. So this is the shaft that the drive motor sits in. Sorry, I didn't mention there's a key in there as well that I've taken out when I took the motor out. So the motor shaft is keyed into there, and I'll just drop the key back in. And this is the shaft. I don't know if you can see it there. This is the shaft that would have been closest to that oil sight glass, and you can actually see there on this side of the shaft where the white paint, when they sprayed the white, has actually gone through the sight glass over all the shafting that was inside the head. So you can see what's happened. You can see how they've done that. So that's the kind of the input shaft, if you like, from the motor. It's got a helically ground gear on the bottom, and that meshes with this first gear shaft here. So the very bottom gear on there is a helical, and they mesh together there. This is your high, medium and low gear shaft, so there's 3 positions on here, and they're moved with the speed selector, which is basically this lever that comes out the front of the head, and that on the end of that lever is this arm with the brass bush, and the brass bush sits in between here and basically lifts that top set of gears up and down that shaft. What I'll show you now on there, something that I was pretty, this is symptomatic of the whole build. So this is the gear selector shaft, and there's this bit of brass that sits, or kind of sits, on the end of the here that's been turned, I think, and it's, it's a rattling good fit. The slightest knock and it just drops off, so it's only ever really going to fit when the gear shaft's in place, otherwise that's just going to keep falling off into the sump. But if you actually look at the machining on this, and hopefully my new camera is going to show this now, I'll try and get close up and see if it'll focus. I don't know if you can see I don't know if you can see the burrs on there, but where they've basically angle ground this by the looks of it, and it's like an absolute razor all around the edge, and there's bits of this flaking off. Look, I've just bent a bit there now, it's just come off in my fingers. So that's kind of dropping into the gearbox just for the sake of a couple of minutes, taking the burrs off once they've, well, I was going to say machined it, but it's not been machined, it's just been butchered, I think it's probably the right word. And the same thing when they've possibly machined the hole. I don't know if you can see the burr on the end there where the exit, that's obviously the exit side of the drill or whatever they've used to put that hole in. But yeah, there's just no clean up of any burrs or anything, and if any of those come loose over time with this thing moving on the shaft, they're just going to drop into the sump and be meshing inside all the gears. That's just really, really poor workmanship. So that's another reason I've stripped it, just to try and do some of the fettling that needs to be done on these castings and stuff. So now it's all stripped, it's easy, it's a 5-minute job. It's dead simple, 5 minutes with a file, job done, and it'll be fine. The other thing that's of note, these shafts that are the gear selecting shafts have got an oil seal at the front where they come through the front of the head. I'm just trying to move this one down the shaft so you can see it now. Just bear with me. Let's see if I can use it to do the other one. They're pretty tight. Well, you'd expect that because it's an oil seal. I'll not move the oil seal itself. So this is the rubber oil seal that sits in the front of the head. Behind it, and to space the oil seal out properly, to get it to the right, I guess the right axial distance, this is what they've used as spacers. So there's 3 circlips there on the shaft that they've used that as a spacer to space that oil seal out to get it in the right position, which, yeah, I'm not even going to describe what that is. So, quick job for the lathe. I'll measure the thickness of the 3, I'm not even going to call them spacers, I'll measure the thickness of those 3 circlips, and I'll turn up a small spacer to go over this shaft and replace these 3 circlips, and I'll put those in a drawer somewhere, and then I'll have 3 circlips that I can use at some point for their intended purpose. So back to the strip down. So we took the top off, this drive shaft came out with the top, this one came out with a tug. The bottom bearing didn't come out, it stayed in the housing in the bottom of the head, right in the very bottom, which I was a bit concerned about because I thought, how am I going to get that out? You can't get to it from the underside to knock it out. Fortunately it had moved up far enough that I just managed to get what I've done with it now. I've got a very stubby, I think it was this one, a very stubby Allen key, and fortunately it moved up just far enough, there was enough clearance to get that Allen key in under the bearing, and basically I just kept moving around and wiggling and wiggling and wiggling. Eventually the bearing came out, so I got lucky with that. So we took that shaft out. We finally took this shaft out at the back, and again what I used there was I got 2 levers on the top of the casting of the head and basically sat under this bearing. I'm not bothered about the bearings because they're going to get replaced anyway. So I put the levers under the top and just basically levered that shaft out, and the bottom bearing fortunately came with it. I don't know if you can hear it. It's not the worst, but it's certainly not the best. That one feels pretty good actually, that one on the top. But while I'm at it, I'm just going to change all of them. So that was the 3 shafts out the way, and then this unit then, this sits on top of the spindle right at the front, and basically once I lifted the head off, so this bearing here and this spacer, fortunately they've actually used a proper spacer this time instead of a huge circlet, that sits in there, you know, into that bore at the front of the casting there. Sorry, that's the back of the casting. I'm telling you porcupines, it doesn't sit there at all. It sits in this bore at the front where the spindle sits, so it sits behind that gear in there. That one came out easily, that was just sat on top of the spindle here once I took that off. Following on from that, I then took this is an oil seal. It's got a couple of rubber washers, and this basically bolts with 3 cap head screws down to the top of the casting inside the head itself, and there's an oil seal here. This is to stop the oil coming back up out the gearbox, you know, up the quill and out the top of the machine. So I took that oil seal off. At this point the quill was still in the machine, it's still fixed in the machine. So to get the quill out, the next job was, what did I take off next? I'm just trying to remember now. I dropped the quill, so the first thing I took off was the spring. So this is the spring for the quill. So I took the spring off. That's going to be a blooming nightmare to refit, and I just know it is. Basically, on the quill, on the pinion that drives the rack on the back of the quill, there's a tiny hole in this end. You can see that hole there, and there's a tiny countersunk screw that goes in there that actually goes, this spring sits on it, and then the spring gets wound up afterwards. I'm dreading putting that bit back together. It came off quite dramatically, spun round a few times. Unfortunately I didn't manage to count how many times it spun round, so there's going to be a bit of trial and error putting that back on. But I'm sure we'll get it on somehow or other. Once I'd taken the spring off, the next thing I had to do was remove the handle section itself. So I took unscrewed the screw completely. Inside there's a spring, there's a cone here that's covered in paint, which is the drive inside of here for your fine feed. So basically there's a taper, there's a machine taper with paint all over it that bites on the inside of this machine taper in here for the fine feed to work. So again, all of that needs a good clean up. And the spring in there is just to either select or deselect that. It's like a clutch. So you're either engaged on that taper or you're not. So your fine feed's engaged or it isn't. So I took the handle section off. I then took the whole fine feed unit off, which is dead simple. It's just 2 screws through the casting, slide straight off the end of the shaft, no bother. Once I got all of that off, this shaft, the pinion shaft, then just slid straight out, no bother. Obviously at that point I'd got my hand under the spindle, because once I slid that pinion out, there was a risk that the spindle would just fall straight out the bottom of the casting. It didn't, and the reason it didn't was in the spindle itself, or in the quill itself, there's a keyway, and there's a key through the casting head that sits in that keyway. So obviously the quill dropped down as far as the top of that keyway, and then it stopped. So then all I needed to do was remove the keyway, remove the key, and then the spindle just dropped straight out the bottom, then straight out. It's got a taper roller bearing in that end that is covered in crap and steel and bits of iron filings and stuff, and it just feels a bit lumpy. As yet, I don't know what's in this end, I've not had a look, so that'll be part of the next bit of the strip down. So that's kind of where I've got to, and that's the order that I've taken it apart in. Oh, one thing I didn't say, once I'd got the top of the head off, the top casting off, the very next job I did was used a tiny little plastic pot, and I just basically bailed out as much of the oil as I could, and I got it down to within sort of, I don't know, half an inch of the bottom, and then I removed the sump plug right at the bottom, and the last bit's drained out into that blue pot that I've just shown you. And then at that point, that's when I started to try and then start removing the remainder of the shaft work and everything. So, well, I guess the only bit I've not spoken about was this, but dead simple. This is the clamp for the quill itself, and you'll see there's just two beveled edges, and they bite in. They bite in either side of the quill, so when you clamp it up, it just basically nips onto the quill and holds it in position. Once I'd got everything out of the way, this just basically slid straight out, no problem. So that's it, I've broken it. and I really don't know whether I'm going to get it back together. I really do hope so. So the next job really now is a bit further stripped down. I'm not going to strip these shafts completely, I'm leaving the gears on where they are, I'm just not going to mess with them. But I am going to pop the bearings off each end. I'll give them a clean first, mark them up, pop them off. I've got a feeling that they're all going to be similar sizes, but I'm going to do them one at a time, measure them. Oh, that's horrible. It's just clattering and clanking. Yeah, they're just, that's what I suspected, the noises I was getting from the mill when I was machining. I mean, there's just that bearing itself there. There's 20 thou play in that by hand. I can just feel it. There's no wonder it's you put a reasonable sized flank cut on, it starts to howl and scream and squeal. That'll be why. So as I say, we'll mark the bearings up, mark the shafts up, pop the bearings off, we'll give them a good measure up, and then I will go and do a bit of research and see what sort of bearings I need to put in that kind of environment. Obviously sat in oil in a gearbox. I'm not a bearing, I don't know much about bearings at all really, so I'll do a bit of research and just make sure I get the right ones for that kind of environment, and we'll go for SKF or something, a known brand bearing. So basically I've got two on that shaft to replace, two on that shaft to replace, two on that shaft, so that's 6 bearings, and then there's the 2 taper roller bearings in the spindle, and I will imagine they're going to be, for decent quality ones, they're going to be probably a bit expensive of those 2, but while I've got it broken down to this level, having felt what they feel like, it's pointless rebuilding it without changing them. So I'm going to knock this apart, we'll get those bearings out, we'll get some identification off them, give them a measure up, and then I'll go and see what's available. So that's kind of it, guys, at the minute. That's where I'm up to. I don't know whether that'll be the end of this episode. I'll start to edit it and just see how many minutes worth of film there is. If we're getting up near the sort of 20-minute mark, I'll probably call that I'll call that a video, I think, and publish it as it is. And then I will film the next part of the procedure, which will be the further strip down, and I'll take you through each stage of the process, and you can all have a jolly good laugh at me when I'm stood here in a couple of weeks scratching my head trying to work out how it all goes back together. So we'll catch you probably on the next video when I'm doing a bit more. So thanks for watching, and see you all soon.